What's going on, guys? So in this video, I'm going to show you guys how you can read and write to a file using Node.js, and you're going to see that it is actually dead simple. And so I've got an index.js file here. There's no code in it at the moment, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to create just an example file that we can use to practice reading and writing from. And I'm just going to call this example.txt. Keep in mind the extension of the file doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, as long as it's some sort of file that you want to be able to read, it could be a JSON file, it could be a CSV file, or it could just be a plain old text file like we are doing in this case. And so I'm just going to add a couple of lines of text so that we can actually try reading from this file. So I'll say, this is my example file. And then I'll say, hopefully you enjoy this video. All right. And let's make sure that we save that. And let's go to our index.js file and let's figure out how we can read from this text file. And I've actually opened up the Node.js documentation, and we're going to make use of the FS module. So that's the file system module. And what we want to do is we want to make use of the read file command. So I'm going to go back to my code, and we're going to import the FS module. So that's just going to be const fs equals require fs. All right. And now to read the file, we're going to do fs dot, and we're going to call that read file. But keep in mind, when you're working with Node.js, you have two different options when it comes to reading and writing to files. You have for example, read file. If I type in read file, you'll see that we actually have two options. We have read file sync and we have read file. So what's the difference? Very simple. Read file sync is a synchronous operation and read file is asynchronous. So if you want to make sure that you don't end up blocking the event loop, then you would call the asynchronous one. If you don't really care, then you can just call the synchronous one. For this video, we're going to actually take a look at how to use both. So don't worry. You'll see that there's very minimal difference between the two, and it's actually really straightforward. But we're going to start off with the read file sync because it's a little bit easier to work with. So we're going to call that. And we have to pass in one argument, and that's going to be the path to the file that we want to read from. And so here, since the example.txt file is in the same exact folder as index.js, I could just say example.txt. However, if it's not in the same folder, then you have to make sure you provide the full path to it. All right, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to save the result to a variable called text. And then we can just console.log it and make sure that we were successfully able to read the contents of that file. So now that I've got that, I'm going to do a node index.js, and let's see what happens. And you can see that we get an interesting result. All right, so what exactly is happening here? Well, what happens is by default, when you run the read file sync, it actually reads it as a buffer instead of regular text characters. So this is obviously not very useful for us. How exactly do we read it as text? Well, we can pass in a second argument, and here you provide the encoding. And you can see that the default encoding is actually defaults to a buffer. So instead, we can pass in a different encoding. And if you put in quotations here, you'll see that VS Code actually gives us the different options. We want UTF-8. And so now if I save that and run this, you can see that we were able to successfully read the contents of our video. And it's that simple, guys. So now that we saw how we can read from a file, let's try to write to a file. So I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to call the FS module, and let's just see what options we have. And you can see already VS Code's offering write file sync or recommending write file sync. So that's probably the method that we want to run. So let's try that. So we'll do write file sync. And there's going to be a couple of different options that we have to pass in. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to provide the path to the file that we want to write to. So once again, I'm going to provide example.txt. The second one's going to be what is the data that you want to write to. So I'll just put in some random text. So I'll say, I wrote this using Node.js. And then finally, we can provide the encoding once again. So I'll do UTF-8. And what we want to do now is let's also take a look at what the text looks like before, which we already did. And let's also take a look at it afterwards. So here, I'm actually going to change this to, I'll say this is the original text. And we'll print that. And I'll just put in here, original text. I'm just going to copy this, paste it down here, and I'll call this new text. And I'll just change this so we can see which one is the new text. All right, let's give that a go now. All right, so you can see we printed the original text, which is those 2 lines. And then the new text says, I wrote this using Node.js. So let's take a look at the example.txt file. And we can see that it says, I wrote this using Node.js. So writing to a file is actually pretty easy as well. Now, one thing to note is when you do write file or write file sync, what happens is it's going to delete all the contents of the file and then write whatever you want to write. So it's going to remove everything that we already had. So the original 2 lines is now gone. So that's something to keep in mind. And I'm sure you're thinking, well, how do we, add a line to the file, right? Like, what if I wanted to add it to the end of this so that we keep all of the contents of the file and we just add it to the bottom? Well, there's a couple of different ways of actually doing that. And what we can do is what we can change to here is we can actually pass in an object where we can provide a couple of different options or flags. So the first thing is, since we removed the encoding, let's put that back. And so I'll say encoding. And then this is going to be UTF-8. But the second option is, this is where we can change the behavior of how write file sync works. We're going to pass a flag. And we're going to pass in the letter A. And I think the A stands for append. So this is going to append to the bottom of the file so we don't overwrite the entire file. And I think this should be somewhere in the documentation. Let me see if I can find this flag. Here we go, flags. File system flags. So here we go. So the first one right here is the one we want. A, open a file for appending. And more importantly, this file is created if it doesn't exist. So if we try to write to a file that doesn't exist, it'll create a new file and it'll append to it. So this is exactly what we want. Let's give that a shot. And so remember what our file looks like. It just says, I wrote this using Node.js. So it should keep this line and it should just append to the bottom. And let's change the text this time. I'll say I am appending file. And let's run this. And now if we take a look at the contents, we can see the original text, which is I wrote this using Node.js. And the new text says I wrote this using Node.js. And then it immediately appends the contents that I wrote. All right, so that clearly worked passing the flag. One thing to note is you probably don't like the fact that it was added to the same exact line. So let's just go back in, and I'm just going to delete this real quick from here. And with text here, we can actually provide the backslash and then the letter N. So that's going to create a new line for us. So now if I run this, right, you could see that in the new text, it put it in 2 different lines. And we can just confirm that by going to example.txt. All right, so pretty simple. This is the first way of appending to a file. On top of that, we actually have a second option, so I'm going to comment that out. And I'm going to call a different method. Instead, I'm going to call append file. So we'll call append file sync. And we can pass in pretty much the same exact data. So it's going to be the file name, example.txt, and then what we want to append. So I'll say this is the other way of appending. And then if you want, you can also provide the encoding. And let's give that a shot. And if we go here, we can see that this is the other way of appending. I didn't do the \n, so it was put in the same line, but you guys get the point. All right, so now I want to quickly show you what happens if we pass in the name of a file that doesn't exist when we do append file or write file. So if I say new file.txt, so if you take a look on the left side, you can see there is no new file.txt within this folder, and that's okay. Anytime you do append file or write file, if the file doesn't exist, it's actually going to create it on our behalf. And so I'll just say, this file didn't exist before. And then make sure you pass a new file here into read file sync. And let's just read the contents. So I'm going to run this again. And let's see what happens. And I forgot to actually comment this out, but that's okay. But you can see new text, this file didn't exist before. And so if we go to new file.txt, you can see that it actually did create the file and it wrote to it. So you don't have to pass in the name of a file that exists. You can pass in a new name and Node.js will be intelligent enough to create the file if it doesn't already exist. All right, so I think that covers reading, writing, and appending to a file synchronously. Let's now take a look at how we can do this asynchronously. So let's comment all of this out. And let's try to do this again asynchronously. So I'm going to do fs dot, and then we'll do read file. And notice how there's two different read file sync, read file. We want read file because we're going to do this asynchronously, so that we don't block the event loop. And we have to pass in the same exact option. So it's almost identical. We're going to pass in the name of the file. And we're also going to pass in the encoding, UTF-8. And by default, I believe the FS module actually is callback based and not promise based. So if you actually want to convert this to a promise, we can actually call a different method, which is promises. And then we just call .read file from this. So this is going to return a promise so that we can use the async await syntax. And what we're going to do is I'm going to just save this in a variable called text, and we're going to call await. So this should read the file, and it should not block the event loop. So if I run this, you can see that we actually get an error, and it's just saying that you can't actually use await outside of a function, right? So you actually have to do it within an asynchronous function. I believe in the newer version of Node.js, I think maybe I haven't updated it, you actually can run this outside of a function, but it's no big deal. We can just create a example function. So I'll just say const myfunc, doesn't really matter what you call it. It's going to be an arrow function. It is going to be an asynchronous function. All right, and we can just copy this and paste it in here. And then I can do a console.log of text. All right, and so this should run asynchronously and not block the event loop. So if I run this, and actually before I run this, we actually have to remember to call the function. So I'll call myfunc. And now let's try running this. And we can see that it did successfully read the contents of the file. Perfect. Now let's also take a look at how we can write to a file asynchronously. And this is the same exact concept. So I'm going to do await fs. And remember, all of the fs modules returns callbacks. We want promises, so we'll do promises dot, and then we do write file. And then we pass in the same option, so example.txt. And then we do writing async. And then we'll read the contents of that file afterwards. So let's run this. And actually, let's actually provide the encoding, UTF-8. So we run this, and we can see it says writing async. And it did successfully update. So everything worked perfectly. One other thing to note, if you don't want to have to always add the dot promises, you can actually change the import. And you can just import /promises. And that way, we can just remove the promises keyword off of these methods. And if we run this again, you'll see that it works exactly the same. All right, and so that's everything I wanted to show you with regards to reading, writing, and appending to a file using Node.js. You can see it's very simple working with files using Node.js, and hopefully you guys enjoyed the video.